Just before I get started, I want to reiterate, I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, which is the homeland of the Cree, the Métis Nation, the Lakota, the Dakota, the Nakota, the Dene, and the Saulteaux people. And I'm really privileged to be here and really happy to share Saskatchewan's history with you. My talk is going to be divided into 3 sections. The first, I'm going to talk a little bit about landforms and the variations in Saskatchewan. The next part, I'll talk to you about what it means to be treaty people. And in the third part, I want to share a few highlights of Saskatchewan history with you that I think are pretty cool. And the reason I'm starting with landforms and land in Saskatchewan is because history isn't just people. The history of Saskatchewan is also the history of the land in our province. And so when you Google Saskatchewan, you often get pictures that look like this: big fields, farmland, big skies, because Saskatchewan's the breadbasket of Canada, right? And it is, it's true. It's one of the 3 prairie provinces with Manitoba and Alberta. And it's the 5th largest province in Canada and one of only 2 that doesn't have a coastline. It's completely surrounded by land. And its boundaries, as you'll notice, are nice and straight, which is totally arbitrary. There's no natural features that makes up any of these boundaries. And so when we think of the prairies, it sounds kind of boring. It's all grass, but there's actually variation within prairies. There's 5 different kinds of prairie. And in Saskatchewan, the prairie that we have the most of is called mixed grass prairie, which means it's very, very ecologically diverse. There's a lot of grasslands because of the name, but there's also sort of shrubs, trees, aspens, poplars, that sort of thing. And if you go to southern Saskatchewan, you can see that mixed grass prairie in its more pristine state in Grasslands National Park, which is a park that's designed to preserve the prairie ecology. And if you look at the bottom left picture, or bottom right, I should say, you can see some of the animals that inhabit mixed grass prairie. So we have burrowing owls, lizards, black-footed ferrets. There's a lot of interesting things in a prairie ecosystem, but they're all hidden. You have to kind of sit there and watch for them. And that's a lot like Saskatchewan. There's a really cool history in this province, but you have to kind of dig for it because we don't share it very much and we don't trumpet how neat Saskatchewan is. But that goes back to the problem. That's 2/3 of the province. The other 1/3 of Saskatchewan actually isn't prairie at all. It's part of the Canadian Shield. And the Canadian Shield is a really old rock formation, and it's characterized by boreal forest and lakes and swampy areas, lots of little lakes. It's very wet in the northern part of Saskatchewan, and there's a lot of mining and development like that. And so that means that in our province, we have 2 really different but equally unique and awesome ecosystems to look at. And one of the things that's very cool in the boreal forest northern part of the province, right up in the northwest corner, in fact, is the Athabasca Sand Dunes. The Athabasca Sand Dunes are about 8,000 years old, and they were created when the ice shield retreated during the glaciation. And when it retreated, it left a lot of sand up in northern Saskatchewan that became the Athabasca Sand Dunes. They are one of the most active sand dunes in Canada, so that means they're constantly reshaped and shifting and moving, so the environment never quite looks the same. And they're also a place where most people in Saskatchewan won't ever visit because they're very remote and you need a boat or a plane to get to them. They're also unique, so there are plants there that grow nowhere else in Saskatchewan, which is part of the reason it's a provincial park, to help protect it. And those dunes that you can see in the picture, the person is walking on the dunes, those dunes can be up to 90 meters tall. 90 meters, which is pretty good. But I know when I first heard about them, I thought, wow, I'd like to see those, but a float plane is kind of difficult. Fortunately for us, there are other places in Saskatchewan where you can see sand dunes. That place is in southwest Saskatchewan, right up along the Trans-Canada Highway. And this is the Trans-Canada here. You can see it in the south portion of this map. And the Great Sandhills are up here by Leader, Saskatchewan. And they are almost as big as the Athabasca Sand Dunes. They only get to about 20 meters in height. And they're also very active. There's a lot of shifting and changing with the dunes there. So even when you see pictures of them, when you visit in person, they might be different because of how active those dunes are. And they're very cool because we are one of those places where it's a unique ecosystem where you see different things that you wouldn't see anywhere else in Canada. And one of those is Ord's kangaroo rat. And the kangaroo rat is this lovely little cute creature in the bottom left of the slide. And we have in Saskatchewan the only population in Canada. The other population is in Alberta in Suffield, and it's a military base. So you can't even see them there. So in Saskatchewan, we can actually go to the sand dunes and see them, which is really cool. And most people have no idea this rat exists. So I always like to highlight it as one of the unique species in Saskatchewan. Staying in the southwest portion of the province, we also have the Cypress Hills. So you can see the Great Sand Hills are by Maple Creek, so just above the Trans-Canada where that little green box is. The Cypress Hills are on the border, so they cover both Alberta and Saskatchewan. And one of the neat things about that is that's also an area where we find a lot of dinosaur fossils in Saskatchewan, in East End, in fact. And one of those fossils is this T-Rex skeleton called Scotty. And it's the biggest T-Rex ever found to date. And we get to have that in Saskatchewan. And I see your question and I will answer it at the end of this, I promise. So just hold on. So the Cypress Hills are a really, really cool feature because they're one of the few places in Saskatchewan that didn't have ice over it when the glaciers covered it. So it had no glaciation, which means it has pre-ice age fossils in it, and it has unique rocks there because the glaciers didn't affect that area. And I'd like to really point out that this is a place with hills. Saskatchewan is not flat. It's got a lot of hills in it. Why it's called the Cypress Hills is kind of interesting. Captain John Palliser surveyed this area for the British in 1857. And he mistook the pine trees for a type of cypress tree, and that was why it was called the Cypress Hills. It's also traditionally been a very important meeting place for Indigenous peoples, and the Métis people have hunted in the hills, and they often wintered in the hills because the environment is a little bit nicer in winter than on the open plains. Now I want to move off from hills and landscapes to talk a little bit about rivers. The South Saskatchewan River is one of the really important rivers in Saskatchewan. You can see here how it goes from Alberta through Swift Current and up to Saskatoon to Prince Albert. It cuts through the populated southern portion of the province. And it's really important as a source of drinking water and a source of irrigation water for farming. And the other thing it is it's changed the watershed because what we did on the Saskatchewan River was we built a dam on it. And I will get to the dam in a minute, but it also goes through Saskatoon. And you can see how in these pictures, the river is very curvy and it wanders around a lot. And that means that it's created a lot of little oxbow lakes in Saskatchewan, which is why Saskatchewan has a big culture of recreation on lakes, is because of these lakes created through the rivers. And an oxbow happens when the river shifts course and the curve of the river is no longer part of the river. So one of those oxbow lakes is Pike Lake up by Saskatoon. So going to the dam, the Gardiner Dam, this is a really, really fantastic engineering project for Saskatchewan. It took 10 years to build this dam. It started in 1958, and it's the largest earth-filled dam in Canada. Even today, it's the biggest earth-filled dam. And the reason they built the Gardiner Dam is because they wanted to control flooding on the South Saskatchewan River and make it so people could build closer to the river and not have to worry about flooding in the spring. The other reason was they wanted it as a source of hydroelectric power, and it still generates hydroelectric power to today. And when they built this dam on the river, they created Lake Diefenbaker, and Lake Diefenbaker reshaped the southern portion of Saskatchewan because it created a really big lake for people to use as a recreation area. And these are just a few of the highlights that are really, really neat about Saskatchewan's landscape beyond the fields, because we all know about fields, but most people don't really realize these are also part of Saskatchewan. So I see one of the questions is, Does the kangaroo rat have a pouch? The kangaroo rat is called a kangaroo rat because it has feet like a kangaroo. So I'll just go back to the picture for you. You can kind of see how the feet are long. They're long like kangaroo feet, and the rats will hop just like a kangaroo, which is why they're called a kangaroo rat. It doesn't have a pouch, unfortunately, which is a little bit sad because I think that would be cool. More information to visit these places. The best place to get information on visiting is from Tourism Saskatchewan, and they have a really good website with lots of information and lots of photos. A lot of these places are provincial or national parks as well, so you can go to Parks Canada or the Saskatchewan Park Service for more information there as well. So I'll just pause a minute and see if anyone else is typing any more questions before we go on to the next section. All right, so the next section I wanted to talk about is treaties. And I call this We Are All Treaty People because this is a really foundational piece of Canadian history. And for me, I think everyone in Canada really it's important that they realize that because treaties are so critical to the formation of our country. So Indigenous people were in Saskatchewan long before it was settled, long before Europeans came to North America. They've been in Saskatchewan for about 11,000 years at this point. And there were extensive trade networks running throughout North America between various groups of Indigenous people, way before Europeans came. So when Europeans arrived in North America, they were looking for furs, for the fur trade, and Indigenous people became an absolutely key part of the fur trade because they would bring furs to European fur traders. And one of the groups that arose out of the fur trade were Métis people, and they have mixed Indigenous and European ancestry, and they began through marriages that happened during the fur trade era. And they're one of the 3 legally recognized groups of Aboriginal people in Canada. The other 2 are First Nations and Inuit peoples. In the prairies, the Métis were really known as buffalo hunters, fur traders, and trappers. And they used Red River carts, which are these 2-wheel carts you could see on the slide. And if you go to museums or you learn more about Métis history, these Red River carts are very symbolic of the Métis people because they use them so much. The question is, they were already in the land that we call Saskatchewan, so how did it get settled with Europeans? To answer that, we have to go back and look at history a little bit. When Canada was first formed in 1867, it was really small. It was just the white part. So the Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritime provinces that show up on this map, just that white area, that's all Canada was. And the Canadian government at that time felt that their country was somewhat small, and they were really worried that the Americans would move north and expand the United States to cover more territory in North America. And they didn't want that to happen. Rupert's land, which you can see is just above where Canada is, was at that time owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. And the Hudson's Bay Company was a very successful British fur trading company. And they essentially had been given by the British Crown permission to do whatever they wanted in Rupert's land. So the Canadian government was very concerned that the Americans were going to come north. They thought the Americans might buy Rupert's land from the Hudson's Bay Company because the Hudson's Bay Company really was only interested in fur trading. It didn't want to deal with the administrative processes that were required as people started moving and living in Rupert's land from Europe. So the Canadian government negotiated with the Hudson's Bay Company, and in 1869, they bought Rupert's land as a way to expand Canada and make it bigger. But one of the conditions for buying Rupert's land was that the Canadian government had to deal with all Indigenous land claims in it. Because remember, this is a map, this is not empty country. This is country that is very much active. It's full of Indigenous people. There's a lot of Métis people in here. It's not empty. There are people here, and the Canadian government wants to expand, but they have to deal with the people there. So that's when they start making treaties. And treaties are the foundational documents of this country, because what they are is nation-to-nation agreements between Indigenous nations and the Canadian government over how the land will be accessed and shared. So functionally, at the very basic level, a treaty is an agreement that special rights and conditions and supplies will be given to Indigenous nations in return for access to land. And that'll be given by the Canadian government. So this map, you can see this is the map of all the treaties that were signed in Canada with Indigenous nations up to 1921. And there are a few more treaties that were signed after that, but they don't show up on this map. So that's why BC doesn't really have any treaties in this map, is because they're too new to show up on it. In Saskatchewan, we are covered by what's called the numbered treaties. So the numbered treaties are Treaty 1, 2, 3, all the way up to Treaty 11. And they were signed between 1871 and 1921. And they're called the numbered treaties because they're numbered in the order they were signed. So Treaty 1 is signed first, Treaty 11 was signed last. For us, when we're in Saskatchewan, we're under Treaty 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, depending on where we're at in the province. And those agreements were signed with the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Assiniboine, and the Dene nations. And that's really important. So the treaties themselves, they all have slightly different language, and you can actually read the treaties for yourself on the Government of Canada website or with the Office of the Treaty Commissioner. In Saskatchewan, we have the Office of the Treaty Commissioner, and their whole job is to make sure the treaties are followed and to explain what they mean. They're really awesome, and they do great educational stuff around treaties. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about Treaty 4. And Treaty 4 allowed the Canadian government to settle land in Saskatchewan with Europeans or whoever they wanted to do economic activities in it. And in return, they would give the First Nations gifts of clothing, payments, farming tools, ammunition, and rights to continue hunting, trapping, and fishing on their traditional lands. The problem with treaties in Canadian history, and this is one of the things, is that when they were signed, Alexander Morris, who oversaw the treaty-making process for the Canadian government, promised Indigenous nations that the treaties would remain as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. That means the treaties are forever. To this day, they have a significant legal, social, and economic impact on Indigenous people and on Canadians. They're very important, and they're the foundational documents on which a lot of our other things rest in Canada. The bad part about Canadian history, and something we're still coming to terms with and grappling with as a country, is the fact that when the treaties were made, Indigenous people were in a transitional period because they were traditionally on the prairies hunting bison, or buffalo as they were called. And the bison had declined because of overhunting due to encroachment from white hunters and trading in bison leather. There was just a huge demand for bison, so they were overhunted. And so the Indigenous people saw their way of life being very threatened. It was becoming very difficult because of the declining bison. So they looked at treaties as a way to succeed and transition into new ways of life, where they didn't rely on the bison as much because they could see that the bison were disappearing, and they knew they needed to do something to continue to be successful. So for them, negotiating treaties was part of how they were going to ensure a successful future, which was very, very reasonable. The problem was that after the treaties were negotiated, the Canadian government really didn't stick to the spirit of the negotiation. So it would make arbitrary decisions on how it would deliver its treaty promises. And one of the very famous ones is the residential schools. So the treaties all had a requirement that education in schools would be given, but the language was quite broad on how this would happen. So residential schools kind of decided, the Canadian government decided residential schools would be how they would fulfill that obligation. And they're a very negative part of Canadian history, because what happened in the residential schools was that they were designed to take away Indigenous culture from the Indigenous children who went to the schools and make them into what the Canadian government considered proper Canadians at the time, which was English speaking and British culture. And one of the very famous photographs of residential schools is this little boy called Thomas Moore Kessick. and he's from the Saulteaux First Nation by Regina. He went to residential school in 1891. And the first picture is where he's in his traditional dress just before he enters the school. And the second picture is how they dressed him when he was in the school. So you can see how they're taking away his culture through that. So what we have to do as Canadians is recognize, you know, these things just really did not go well. The schools were overcrowded. The children, there was a lot of abuse in them. They took away the culture. They didn't allow them to speak the language. And Thomas actually died 4 years after he went into the school. So we recently had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission investigate the history and the lasting impacts of the schools. And what they said is reconciliation is about coming to terms with events of the past, even when they're really awful and it's really bad history. And part of that coming to terms with it is recognizing what went wrong and not repeating it and trying to reestablish and rebuild healthy and respectful relationships going forward. And part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was 94 calls to action to encourage reconciliation, and land acknowledgements, which you heard at the beginning of this talk, are one of those reconciliations that we want to take. And the reason we do land acknowledgements is they're about, you know, acknowledging the past, acknowledging that there is this relationship and we want to make it positive and respectful moving forward into the future. And it also reaffirms the treaties and the importance of honoring the treaties and fulfilling them in the spirit and the intent to which they were promised. So that's why you'll see land acknowledgements are different as well, because the land acknowledgement is based on which treaty you're in. And again, the Office of the Treaty Commissioner is a really awesome resource if you want to learn more, and they do great educational stuff, as do a lot of other places like the Gabriel Dumont Institute, the Badash National Historic Site. There's lots and lots of stuff about treaty education that shows up over the year. So I see I've got a few questions. So the first one is, did the First Nations come into Saskatchewan first, or did they come to different provinces? That's a great question. Theoretically, there's still definitely argument about this. Most people will tell you the First Nations came over the land bridge, so they would come from in the west of North America and then move east across the continent. So they probably came into Saskatchewan before they got down into Ontario, but again, that's really arguable, and nobody's quite sure. The archaeologists are still looking at it and still working with Indigenous people today to try and figure that out. Are the First Nations related to Aztecs? Also a great question. Short answer is maybe, we're not sure. Aztecs are an Indigenous people in South America, so Indigenous people in North America may be related, but again, I'm not quite sure. Explain the treaties in detail. I could spend days talking about the treaties because there's so much going on with them. So if you have specific questions, please do feel free to ask them. In short, the thing about treaties is they're the basis for all our laws and our property rights, and everything is resting on the treaties, because those are agreements about sharing the land and how it will be shared and what the reciprocity for using this land. So that's really important, and it's really foundational. So it's really one of the biggest things about reconciliation is making sure those treaties are honored and fulfilled, not just in the spirit, but in the intent too. Okay, so that was a pretty heavy section. So the next section I want to talk about is building Saskatchewan. And I promise I'll talk a little bit more about different things as well in this, but I want to highlight for you in this section some events in Saskatchewan history that I think are really fun, and they're also events that tend to get referenced a lot because they've been really foundational and had a really big impact on the formation of people and the history of people in the province. The first question is, how did we get the province of Saskatchewan in the first place? Before Saskatchewan was even a province, it was part of something called the Northwest Territories, which ran from the border with the UNS all the way up into what is today the Northwest Territories territory, into the Arctic. And what happened was people in Saskatchewan really wanted more self-government. They wanted to have more freedom to do what they wanted, as opposed to having the federal government sort of tell them what to do, because they weren't technically a province. So the premier of the Northwest Territories was this guy called Frederick Haltain. And he really wanted the Northwest Territories to be a province. And his idea was that there would be one giant prairie province called Buffalo. And he thought it was a great one. He said, well, it's one big province. One big province would be able to do things no other province could. And if it had been that big, it would have been sort of equal size to Ontario and Quebec. The federal government, because it was headquartered in Ontario, wasn't entirely sure, and a lot of people in Ontario and Quebec weren't entirely sure they wanted one big prairie province. That seemed like a lot of political power. So Frederick Haltain's idea of the great province of Buffalo didn't go anywhere. No one outside of the prairies really thought that was a great idea. So instead, what the federal government did was it created two provinces in the prairies, Saskatchewan and Alberta. And that's why Saskatchewan has those really straight, really arbitrary boundaries. And you can see how arbitrary it is because Lloydminster, which is up kind of on the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan, about there, it's divided in half. The provincial border actually divided the town of Lloydminster in half when it was drawn because the borders were so arbitrary. And that's how we got to be called this very flat, easy to draw province of Saskatchewan. The first premier was this guy called Walter Scott, and he was quite long serving as well. So the thing was, the Canadian government really wanted the prairies to be settled by Europeans, preferably British people. And the way to settle it, the reason they wanted to settle it was for two reasons. One, they really wanted people in the prairies. And two, they were very, very concerned that the Americans were going to come and try and take over the prairies. This is a reoccurring theme in Canadian history in the 1800s. The Americans might take over Canada. So to counter that, first, they built the railway across the prairies in the southern part of the prairies, which is the Canadian Pacific Rail Line, which you can see today if you are driving on the Trans-Canada Highway. All the trains that you see will be on that Canadian Pacific Railway. The second part was they wanted to encourage people to settle, and to do that they needed the railway to get people out to the prairies because it was quite a long distance. And you'll see on this map for the Canadian Pacific, there's the Great Fertile Belt right underneath their name. And this is a map of the prairies. And the prairies were called the Great Fertile Belt because they really wanted to encourage people to come out and be agricultural, to be farmers in the prairies. And the railway was the way you got people out there. These two photos, the photo on the left, you can see is kind of an example of a typical railway station in the prairies. This one's bigger. And then the other one is a train covered in snow. And this was one of the problems with the prairies, was winter. Winter was not enticing. They didn't want to, at one point, the Department of the Interior actually told people who were in Europe trying to get people to settle in the prairies, don't talk about winter. Talk about the summer instead. Winter's just too terrible. So when people settled in the prairies, they sometimes got a bit of a rude shock when they got winter because all the advertisements talked about the prairies as almost a summer paradise all the time. There was very little talk about the cold weather, which was very frustrating. And the trains, because of the big blizzards in the prairies, would sometimes be quite late because of having to clear the tracks. So today, our legacy of that prairie settlement and the legacy of using railways to get people out to the prairies is that Saskatchewan has two major railway tracks across the province. The first, those bright red lines on the map, is the Canadian Pacific Railway. That's in the south. And it was built about 1882, 83. And then in the early 1900s, the Canadian Northern Railway, which today is called Canadian National Railway, built those dark blue rail lines on the north part of Saskatchewan. And you'll notice this is all in the prairie area because people were supposed to become farmers. So they weren't interested in putting railways in the north, in the Canadian Shield area in the province. So these are a couple examples of posters that they used in Europe to encourage people to come to Saskatchewan, to come to the prairies and actually become farmers. And you'll notice that the posters are very bright, and the one on the right is says, "Get your home in Canada." And the Canadian Pacific Railway actually would sell you a pre-built farm. So the house would be there, the barn would be there, the fences were there. You could come and just start farming if you had a lot of money to do that. Okay, one of the questions, who built the railway? That is an awesome question. The railway in the south, the Canadian Pacific, was built by the Canadian Pacific Railway Company, and it's part of the Trans-Canada Railway. So the idea was that Canada was such a big country geographically. To get people traveling through the country, you needed a railway to link it together, and the Transcontinental Railway that was built by the Canadian Pacific would do that. So the short answer is a private company built the railway, but it built it with a lot of support from the federal government, because the federal government very much wanted a railway to tie the nation together and be able to move people and goods across it very easily. So the Canadian Pacific built the railway. The workers on the railway in BC, there were a lot of Chinese people who came and built the railway there. When settlers came in the prairies, later, early settlers, would help build the railway as a way to get money to finance their farms, because working on the railway was really hard work. But yeah, Canadian Pacific built the railway. So settlement, most of the settlers in Saskatchewan in the late 1800s, early 1900s came from Europe. So this is an example of a German family who settled around Strasbourg. And the Canadian government, again, because at the time the Canadian government felt the British were the best, so they really wanted British people to come. So they encouraged people to come who were British. And if you weren't British and you decided to settle in Saskatchewan or to settle in Canada to farm at this time, there was a very strong push to become English speaking and adopt British customs and cultures, because that was the Canadian way. So you'll find a lot of people who moved to Canada between about 1867 and say 1930 really are pushed hard to give up their own cultures and become English speaking as well, because that's the dominant culture in Canada. So the settlers came for a lot of reasons, but one of the really big ones was that the Dominion Land Act gave settlers a quarter section of land to homestead, and they had 3 years to show that they had successfully done that, and then they could get another quarter section. And that was very enticing, because most of the people who were settlers didn't have an option to own land when they were in their home country. So they wanted to come to Canada and own this, what was thought of as free land, because they just had to improve it and make it a farm. And Saskatchewan was going to be an agricultural paradise. So they came hoping for a better life. And they came, some settlers came because they wanted to escape persecution. So we've got Jewish settlers started Jewish farm colonies in Saskatchewan. And one of the other really cool things is we also had settlers from the US come to Saskatchewan. And two of those people were Mattie Mays and Julius Caesar Lane. And they had a black farm settlement at Maidstone, Saskatchewan, and the Baptist church there was just declared a heritage building because of how important that history of black settlers in Saskatchewan is to our province. But it's, again, one of those things that kind of is a cool history, but is a little bit hidden. So I wanted to highlight that because many people haven't heard about that. So farming was really difficult. It was very hard work to start a farm in Saskatchewan because the land had to be broken, stones had to be removed. It was really difficult. And then when people started to be successfully farming, they realized that they were getting very poor prices for their grain. And they wanted to be paid better for their grain so they could actually make a profit farming. And this is part of where Saskatchewan's legacy as a province where there was a lot of cooperation and people worked together comes from, is because all the settlers who were grain farmers came together because they thought they could do better working together than individually. And they started something called the Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association. And that's their board of directors from 1920. And you'll notice there's a few women in that board too. So it's not just a bunch of guys, which I think is very cool. And the other picture shows all the contracts for the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool, which was a cooperative organized by the farmers to market and handle their grain so they could get better prices for it. And the wheat pool had grain elevators where the grain was delivered and then moved onto trains. And these are extremely iconic symbols of Saskatchewan. You'll see the grain elevators, that peaked roof building, everywhere when you look at sort of pictures of Saskatchewan or artwork that's supposed to symbolize what is Saskatchewan, because these grain elevators were in every town in Saskatchewan at one point, and they always had the name of the town on them. So pilots flying in the prairies would be able to tell what town they were at because they would see the name on the grain elevator, which was pretty cool. So this was really, really impressive. The Saskatchewan Wheat Pool was one of the biggest cooperatives in Saskatchewan, and it's the roots of why Saskatchewan's considered a province of cooperation, because it was so very big and so very successful. And you can see that to today because of Saskatoon co-ops, and throughout Saskatchewan you'll see co-ops and that sort of thing. The next piece of Saskatchewan history that had a really big impact was the Great Depression in the 1930s. In 1929, the stock market crashed, so there was an economic depression. And in Saskatchewan, there was a drought. There was no rain. It was very, very dry, made farming extremely difficult. And people had dust storms. It was so dry that the dust would blow up, and they talked about the fields blowing away because of the wind and the dust. And so what would happen is, you can see in these pictures, the dust would show up as like big clouds on the horizon, and then the dirt would pile up around the houses. So this was really, really unpleasant for people to live in. And a lot of people abandoned their farms at that time because it was so difficult to farm. And with the economic depression, the government of Saskatchewan actually did a bunch of projects to try and give people jobs. And one of those projects was building the Broadway Bridge in Saskatoon, just to employ people so they could have a job, since there were so many people out of work at that time. So the Great Depression is one of those touchstones in Saskatchewan history because of how it impacted pretty much everyone in the province. And it was also one of the things that created a lot of the infrastructure, like bridges in the province, as well as those projects to give people a job. Now, moving on to the 1960s, this is another thing that is absolutely iconic in Saskatchewan. And one of the things our province is known for is Medicare. So the problem prior to the intervention of Medicare was people in Saskatchewan were generally struggling to pay for healthcare. There was a lot of questions about, did you see a doctor? Were you sick enough to pay to see a doctor? And so people in Saskatchewan really wanted to have healthcare where they could afford it. And it wasn't a question of if they could find the money to pay for it. So the first time they did it was in 1917. Rural farm women actually organized to get legislation so their communities, their towns, could do town-funded healthcare. But this wasn't enough. This didn't cover the whole province. It was just a very small start in the very long history of the struggle to get public healthcare in Canada. And that culminated in the election of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation in Saskatchewan as the provincial government. And they promised that if they were elected, they would bring in universal, publicly funded healthcare so that no one would have to ask, can I afford to see a doctor? This was a very, very controversial question at the time, because not everyone supported it. They were worried about changing the system because they weren't sure if it would work. So the leader of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation was a guy called Tommy Douglas, and you can see him up here on the slide. And he was actually voted the greatest Canadian for his role in creating Medicare in Saskatchewan. What happened was that he was the head of the CCF, and his position was taken over by Woodrow Lloyd because Tommy Douglas decided to become a federal politician. And Woodrow Lloyd, who is one of these people that does a lot of work, but you won't hear him talked about a lot in Saskatchewan because Tommy Douglas started the whole thing, but Woodrow Lloyd had to make it work. He put in Medicare in July 1st, 1962. And the doctors in Saskatchewan actually went on strike because they were so worried about what this program would mean, having the government administer healthcare. And for 23 days, the doctors in Saskatchewan were on strike until they could reach an agreement with the CCF over how this would work. ultimately they did. And the experiment in Saskatchewan was so successful and it worked so well to have publicly funded healthcare that it was expanded to be Canada-wide in 1966. And that's become the Canada Health Act today. Now, I'm an agriculturalist as history, so I wanted to give you one agricultural topic before I left, which is canola. So canola is that wonderful bright yellow field you'll see driving around Saskatchewan in the summer, and it's an edible oil. It's considered a very healthy oil today. But when it was first cultivated in Canada, it wasn't considered fit for people. It was only good for a machine oil. And the Canadian government worked with plant breeders from Agriculture Canada and plant breeders at the University of Saskatchewan to create a variety of canola that would actually be edible for people. It would be really good for humans, actually. And so in 1971, this guy called Balder Stephenson, who was an Agriculture Canada plant breeder working in Saskatchewan, finally got a type of canola that would survive, you know, Saskatchewan's climate and be really good for people. And so in 1971, Span canola was released. And this was the first variety of canola that was really promising for being something people would eat. And it turned out to work really well. And canola today is one of the biggest, most valuable crops in the prairies. And it's called canola because the original name of the plant was actually rapeseed, but that was a bit off-putting. So they changed it to canola, which is an amalgamation of Canada and oil to show that this new variety came from Canada. So that's why we have these wonderful yellow fields of canola all over Saskatchewan, is it's such an important crop in the province. It's actually the second most important after wheat. And you'll see in Saskatchewan today, we're diversifying a little bit. So we have also mustard, lentils, and peas as well as grown in Saskatchewan. So I'm really glad you came out to hear this talk. So the question is canola grown in Canada a genetically crop? Yes, canola is a genetically modified crop in Saskatchewan, and that's part of the history of canola that goes up into the 90s and the 2000s. But it's the same base crop that was created and released in the 1970s. So I hope what you got from this presentation is that Saskatchewan has a very wonderful history that's lots of interesting things in it, but I could go on for days. And there's a lot of interesting land in Saskatchewan as well. We often think of our province as very flat and agricultural, and it is very flat and agricultural, but there's more to it than that. So Saskatchewan is a really, really wonderful place with a great history of people working together and trying to improve life in the province. This is a list of places you could go if you'd like to learn more about any of these topics. Wanuskewin Heritage Park is just outside of Saskatoon, and they recently introduced a bison herd. So you can see bison there. And the Western Development Museum has 5 locations across the province. So thank you very much for coming to this talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'm happy to take any questions.